We ended up last time talking about the Battle of Arabella, which is crucial because it determined that the Persians, who were overwhelmingly the dominant number of people in the culture at that time, did not take over Greece. And we inherited things like democracy and our system of other aspects of our system of government, and even the beginnings of science from Aristotle. We inherited them from the Greeks instead of the Persians, which incidentally had more or less as highly developed culture, but not a democracy. Incidentally, in Greece, it was only democracies for those people who weren't slaves, which was the majority of the people. But that's an issue we don't want to discuss. Now, here we have a bunch of Persians on their war technology of the time, and because they were from grassier areas, there's no forest there, or not a lot of forest, and so who lives on grass versus on trees? Horses. There were wild horses in that area, and the Persians exploited, as Diamond explains, these horses. See, it's all connected. Now, the people who figured out how to do in the Persians were initially the Greeks, and a little later, the Macedonians, which is sort of northern Greece. And we'll show you where this is on a map in a little bit. And for a long time, the Greeks just fought amongst themselves. Athens fought Sparta. Sparta fought Athens, and that's all they did. Now, we got a lot of culture and ideas and wonderful things from Athens. And if they say you have a Spartan existence, sometimes you say, oh, they're Spartan existence. When Spartan boys were, I think, about 6 or 8, they went off to military training camp, and they spent the rest of their life until they were in their 30s in military training every day. The men were completely separated from the women, and it's amazing that, I mean, they were always having a problem having enough young people coming into the armies. I guess they had some ways to figure out how to get them together from time to time. But basically, they spent their life learning how to fight. Their whole life from age 8 or so until age 30 or so. And what it was all about, and what made the Greeks so incredible in this, was discipline. To get people to do what was shouted at them by their officers at exactly the right time and in exactly the right way. To turn right when they said right, to turn left when they said left, to go forward or back, or raise or lower their spears, or whatever. Now, as we said last time, Darius came in at these guys with 1 million soldiers. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million soldiers. They came into 47,000 Greeks looking more or less like this. And they got slaughtered. And the Greeks lost very few people. And so, this is part of the whole emergence of human culture, was a culture of discipline, of getting people to do, as a group, what is supposedly good, quotes, for the group. Now, where does this live on in contemporary culture? Well, we train our young people in the Army to follow orders, very much. Same kind of thing, but more, with more modern technology, of course. But even for young people, how about on athletic teams? Drill, 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 right? And why do you learn to drill? Because you can do more as a team than you can do as individuals. And I play hockey, and I never got drilled, and so I never was very good. But the young people, they're often starting to get drilled at 6, and then they become great hockey players or whatever, basketball players, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the way we have sports now, you need both discipline and individual achievement. And I'm sure they had individuals here that did other things. We'll talk about that in a moment. But most of the regular folks spent their whole life learning how to do this kind of stuff. I told you how the chariots would come in And they were so disciplined that they would move aside like that just a split second before the chariot got there. And the chariot would just go right down this hollow, and there'd be some guys waiting there with spears to get him in the back. And they wiped out Darius's troops. They killed them by the tens of thousands. And they flee, and they went away. They didn't like that. Okay, so that was then taken over by Philip of Macedonia and his son Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great took this military technology after the Persians were completely defeated, and he went as far away as India, maybe even put his toe in China. And I've seen a documentary of, somebody followed where his armies had gone at that time, and it was unbelievable. Everybody, they woke up in the morning, have some breakfast, and they march all day, come across some new people and say, well, excuse me, sir, we'd like to have your crop that you spent all this year doing, and if we don't do that, we're going to kill you, all your children and your wife. It's you and his 47,000 Greeks. So, all right, so they just would go and rape and plunder and take whatever they wanted, but Alexander was also interesting because he began to introduce a disciplined form of government that in fact made many of the areas that he had conquered, at least while he lived, a safer place to live. So we can't say he was just an SOB, and the older he got, the more and he only lived to 35 or something. The older he got, the more interested he was, not in conquering, but in trying to understand the even more difficult problem of taking people with all of their quarrels and all of their different perspectives and get them to agree that in their common interest they should be governed in some way that doesn't allow you to hack off the head of your neighbor if you're unhappy with him. Okay, next. Also, the Greeks built ships and ships and ships. And the Athenian and the Spartan ships clashed many times. Mostly the Athenians won until at the end, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the important thing is, how did they pay for it? They had to bring stuff from all over the world to get this. They paid for it with silver. Where did all this stuff come from? Next. Didn't come from the Roman Empire. We're going to come back to this question. Okay, then the Romans come along. We wondered whether you guys are too young to understand why that's funny. How many understand why it's funny? Oh, pretty good. Uncle Sam beat you. So Laura found this picture, and we thought you'd enjoy this. So along came the Romans, and they had a certain history that prior to their encounter with the Greeks, but they had to figure out how to deal with these phalanx. And they couldn't go anywhere towards establishing the Roman Empire until they could figure out what to do about a phalanx. Next. So what they did, well, first of all, is they gave everybody shields in their army. That didn't help much. And they put them all in metal. So it turned out that a huge proportion of the population was spending all their time banging out armor from metal, from iron. Next. They also, hey, the Olympics, you do the javelin throw. Why do you think you do the javelin throw? This is how you get around those long spears. And the further and more accurately you can throw it, then the more, what they did was they would go and they would throw these javelins, which were heavy enough to pierce the shields and the armor of the Greeks, and they'd all aim for a particular part of the Greeks' line, and then they had something quite different. They had the short sword. And so what they do is if this is the phalanx coming at you, and here's a bunch of Romans, then throw all the javelins in here, so these people are dead here, and then you come in, and here, you're holding your spears out this way, right? And you're holding your spears out this way, right? Okay, and then you come in like here, and your spear is way out there. You can't turn it around to get me, right? So I go, hack, 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 hack. And that's how the Roman technology beat the Greek phalanx. Then the phalanx was passé. It didn't work anymore. A new technology came out. But the new technology required a lot of metal, because you had to protect yourself. And it required you thinking all the time. It's like, you know, you figure out, you play basketball. What's a strategy you're going to use when you go against Georgetown or something? You sit around, right? And if you play on a basketball team, I don't know if there's any SU basketball players here. It doesn't look like there's too many people real tall. But I'm sure they sit around a whole lot, just like the ancient Romans were, and say, that's where they're strong. How do we exploit it? And this is what they did. Next. They built this enormous city called Rome, put a wall around it, and lived happily ever after. Well, for a while, the Romans from Rome right here captured all of Spain, all of France, much of Germany, half of England, all of Greece, all of Asia Minor, all of down here to Egypt, where they got their grain from. They had to get their grain from Egypt because their own soil was gone, more or less. And the Nile River kept regenerating the soil here. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, next. Now I want to look at all of this from the perspective of resources, and I want to come back again to Perlin's wonderful book. I think many of you would really enjoy reading this. As I said, it's just 12 or 13 bucks from Harvard University Press. It's a fantastic book. The role of wood in the development of civilization. So I've shown you a little bit about what happened in the development of civilization in cities, in agriculture, in warfare, in who conquers who, and so forth. Well, you read Perlin, and it's all about who's got the forest resources and who wipes out their forest resources. So it's like this. This is a reconstructed house in ancient Ur. Remember Ur, that city? It was just all ruins that we saw the picture of. That's how it exists today. But when they reconstructed ancient Ur, they find that there's these enormous pillars of wood in the houses and in the temples and in the seats of power. And so these are from enormous trees, and there aren't any, you saw in that picture, there's no trees anywhere around there, right? Well, there had been once. Not just trees, but enormous trees. Here's the interior of another house of that time, and it's just all constructed from wood. In areas where there are no forests now at all. Here's constructing an ancient warship, and it's just all about wood. There's a guy with an axe and people carrying boards and doing all sawing right there and so forth. Groups of people hauling logs around and everything. So all of this, of course, has to come from a forest somewhere. Next. All the metals that we talked about that are used in domestic situations, that was made from forests too, because the energy to melt the copper and the bronze and the tin came from forest. That there's only, basically, their only source of high temperature energy was from the forest. Next, how they do that. Incidentally, this is from a little bit later in time, but this was happening back then too, is that they're making armaments, cannons, whatever armaments they made, all that metal armor that the Roman soldiers had and so forth, were made by making a big furnace. There's a guy putting charcoal into a furnace and melting the iron, and out it comes, and then you go ahead and you make whatever you're making, your swords and your armor and your pots and pans and everything else. Next. So what happened to the landscape? Well, it went from forest to non-forest, just like we're doing today in the tropics. Next. Here is a picture of people making charcoal. They build up more and more and more wood into a big pile, and then they light it and let it burn with very little oxygen getting in there. And when you're all done, you make charcoal. And charcoal is very good because charcoal burns hot. So you need to make charcoal in order to make metals. Next. So the net effect of all of this was all of these areas. Let me just kind of connect you. Here's the Mediterranean, here's Italy, here's Spain, Portugal, North Africa. All of these areas were covered with forests. The climate is appropriate there for forests, as we have learned. And what happened was all of these forests were cut. In fact, the forests of the Peloponnesian Peninsula here in Greece, where Athens is here and Sparta is here, all of these forests were completely eliminated on 3 different times. 3 different times. And each time the forests were gone, the civilizations collapsed. And that's why Sparta won sometimes and Athens won another time. Athens cut down all of its trees in order to mine silver to pay for the ships. And then it had no timber to make the ships out of. So they went up here and they tried to capture up here Amphipolis, and they got wiped out trying to do that. But those guys had trees. That's why Philip of Macedonia did so well, because he had forests, he had resources. He wasn't restricted by a lack of fuel or by a lack of money, because he had enough trees to burn to make silver, to make coins. Now, what happened when the forest disappeared? Look at this ancient city in Greece, Ephesus. That's where it was in the 7th century before Christ. They have ancient maps and ancient documents. We know it was right on the Aegean Sea. Now, and here's the Cayster River, and over time, when there was deforestation, all the silt came down, all the soil came down, until that's where it is in the 2nd century AD, very far away from the sea. And what's happened, it's all filled in with the soil that came down when they cut down the trees. So this is the basic story of civilization that you don't hear in your history classes. Somebody finds some metal. They chop down the trees to exploit the metal, or to build ships so you can rip it off from someone else, or whatever, or trade. And they flourish for a while. Remember Tainter, the collapse of complex systems? They have their moment in the sun. And when they cut down the trees, they have about 100 years, or maybe a little more, where they've got good soils exposed to the sun. They put in their agriculture. It goes well. But you go to Greece now, most of it's all rocks, no soil. But you used to have wonderful soil when the forests were there. But the soils then go away. They go downhill with the rain, with the rivers. They fill up the estuaries, the mouths of the rivers, and it becomes more and more expensive to trade, to do whatever you do, and harder to grow your food, and your civilization collapses. Happens again and again and again and again. India, for example, was deforested in the same way 3 times. Next. Let's see if we can do this. Now, a question exists today, whether or not we can live today in a forest-based system. We're a forestry school, at least originally. Can we support the people we have today in the forest? So let's look in Maya, what's called the Maya heartland. It's now called Yucatan. Next. This is southern Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, going down here into Guatemala and perhaps a little bit of Honduras. This is basically, look at all these cities. This area used to have maybe 20 million people. As many people as Mexico City today. There were cities down here, not that one, but one of these in here, Naco, I think, that were half the size of Manhattan, made of stones, in all cities, in all buildings. Next. Huge places. Now they're trying to maintain this as forest today, as a biosphere reserve, but they want to be able to support people there based on the forest without cutting the forest down. Next. The ancient Maya built entire huge cities like this, as I said, half the size of Manhattan. Incredible cities. Next. Here is the edge of the Mexico and Guatemala. Mexico has a huge population growth. Guatemala, until recently, had little population growth. Mexico has a policy of trying to give peasants their own land. Guatemala has no such policy, and most of this they want to preserve as forests. Next. You see, that's the border here of Guatemala and Mexico, what we were looking at from the satellite. Go back one, is that? Well, that's all right. Now, here's a typical family. From there, lots of kids. So, what's happening? You know what's happening. More and more people. Can we support these people on the forest? Well, there's no forest in this background. They've all been cut because people can't eat trees. Next. So that's what people are doing. Next. Just go another one. We're trying to use satellite image to figure out how many people could be supported here. Next. Next. And here's the final graph. And this is how many people there are per square kilometer, per square mile if you want. And this is how many people you could support simply on the forest with no agriculture. Here's how many people there are now. 2 or 3 times that much. And the population seems to be increasing like that in the future. We're not quite sure. If you cut it all down and had a certain type of agriculture called shifting cultivation, maybe you could have this many people. What we don't know is when those Mayan cities were there, we could have 5 or 6 times more people than we can support today. We don't know how they did it. And we don't know if there once was good soil there and it's all gone, or if they were simply far more clever than us and could support these enormous cities. But the bottom line is, as we understand things today, you cannot support a large population and maintain a natural forested ecosystem. They just don't work together. And I will leave you with that horrible problem for the weekend.